Two alien girls banished to Earth, only to discover love instead. HFY sci-fi story. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get into the story. Today's story begins with two alien girls, Lyra and Zara, who were banished to Earth, a planet completely foreign to them. They had no idea what to expect. What they found, however, would change everything they knew about survival and love. But before we get into that, let's go back to our main character, Ethan. Ethan was a man who lived alone, his life a quiet routine after the tragic loss of his family. He had been drifting for years, never really finding a purpose. The Earth he had known was not kind to him, and after losing his wife and daughter in a car accident, he had withdrawn from the world. His days were filled with the same monotonous tasks, a never-ending loop of work and loneliness. One morning, as he was heading out for a walk to clear his mind, the heavy mist of the forest seemed to swallow him whole. The scent of wet earth and pine filled his senses as he trudged deeper into the woods, not really caring where he was going. He had just needed to get away from the constant reminders of his old life. But today was different. Today, his solitude would be interrupted. Ethan's eyes narrowed as he heard something moving nearby. His hand instinctively went to the knife he kept tucked in his belt. He wasn't expecting any trouble, but the forest was full of surprises. As he crept closer, the sounds became clearer. Two figures, stumbling through the dense brush. He couldn't make out much at first, but then, through the fog, he saw them. Two women, barely standing, their bodies bruised and covered in dirt. Their skin, a strange violet hue, shimmered in the dim light. They were unlike anything Ethan had ever seen. He froze for a moment, unsure of what to do. His first instinct was to turn around and leave. They could have been dangerous, but something about them, something in their eyes, told him they weren't a threat. In fact, they looked terrified, vulnerable even. Slowly, cautiously, he approached them. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice low. The taller one, the one with silver hair that seemed to glow even in the murky light, looked at him with wide, fearful eyes. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. Her breath was shallow, and she seemed weak, on the verge of collapse. The other, smaller one, struggled to stand on her own. She had the same strange skin and hair, but her eyes were filled with more suspicion than fear. Ethan's heart softened. He wasn't sure what was happening, but these girls were in trouble, and he couldn't just leave them there. "You're safe now," he said, stepping forward. "Let me help you." They looked at him, and for a moment, Ethan thought they might run. But then the taller one, Lyra, nodded. It was a small gesture, but it was enough. He carefully helped them both to their feet, noticing how fragile they were. Despite their alien appearance, they were just like him in one way, survivors. As he led them through the woods, Ethan's mind raced. What were they doing here? How had they ended up on Earth? But none of that mattered right now. The only thing that mattered was getting them somewhere safe. He couldn't ignore the pull he felt to help them, even if it meant putting himself at risk. As they reached the edge of the forest, Lyra spoke for the first time, her voice soft and hesitant. "Thank you," she said, her eyes full of gratitude and something else, something deeper. "We didn't know where else to go." Ethan nodded, leading them toward his small cabin in the clearing ahead. He had no idea what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was doing something important. As Ethan led the two alien girls toward his cabin, the world around them seemed to fall away. The thick trees of the forest, with their tall, twisting trunks, stood like silent sentinels as the light from the setting sun filtered through the leaves, casting long shadows on the ground. Lyra and Zara had been quiet since Ethan had first helped them to their feet, their strange violet skin shimmering faintly in the soft light. The cold air felt sharp against Ethan's skin, but the silence between them was even sharper. Lyra's eyes remained downcast, lost in thought, while Zara kept glancing around, her posture tense, as if expecting danger at every turn. Ethan couldn't help but notice the way they moved, their steps hesitant but purposeful, as though they were navigating a world completely foreign to them. Finally, as they approached the cabin, Lyra spoke, her voice low but steady. "Why are you helping us?" she asked, her eyes meeting his for the first time since he had found them in the forest. Ethan hesitated, unsure how to explain. "I guess. I just couldn't leave you out there. No one should be alone in a place like this." Lyra frowned slightly, as though his words were difficult to understand, but she didn't press further. Zara, on the other hand, looked at him skeptically. "You don't know us. You don't know what we're capable of," she said, her tone sharp, almost defensive. Ethan shrugged, trying to hide the unease he felt at the back of his mind. "I don't need to know everything. I just know that I couldn't walk away." They reached the cabin, a small structure made of weathered wood with a thick stone chimney, and Ethan opened the door, stepping aside to let them enter first. The warmth of the fire inside immediately hit him, a welcome contrast to the chill outside. Lyra and Zara hesitated at the threshold, unsure whether to trust this human enough to step inside. "It's safe here," Ethan said, his voice calm but firm. Lyra gave him a long look before stepping through the door, followed closely by Zara. Once inside, Ethan went to the fireplace, stoking the fire with a few logs. He had a small stockpile of food in the cabin, enough to last a week or so if he rationed it, and he was sure there were supplies that would help the girls recover. Lyra and Zara sat down at the small table by the window, their eyes still scanning the room, cautious but intrigued by the human's hospitality. "You said you didn't know what we're capable of," Lyra said after a long pause, breaking the silence. "But we're not just refugees. We're not just running away." Ethan looked over at her, feeling a sense of both curiosity and concern. "What do you mean?" Lyra took a deep breath before speaking again. "We come from a world where power is everything, where survival depends on strength." She glanced at Zara, who was still holding herself rigid, her eyes distant. "We were exiled for showing weakness. But that weakness, it's part of us." Ethan frowned, unsure of what she meant. He walked over to the table and sat down across from them. "I don't understand. What exactly happened?" Zara spoke up then, her voice strained but clear. "We were part of a rebellion," she said quietly. "We challenged our leaders, tried to change things. But we failed. And because of that, we were banished." Ethan's heart sank as he listened. He had a feeling that there was more to their story, more that they weren't telling him. But he knew better than to press them too hard. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "No one should be treated like that." Lyra's eyes softened for a moment, but the hard edge in her voice returned quickly. "We weren't banished because of what we did. We were banished because we were seen as a threat." She leaned forward, her gaze intense. "Now we're stuck here, on this planet, alone, and we don't know how to survive." Ethan thought about that for a moment. He couldn't imagine what it must be like to come from a world where power ruled everything, and then be cast out, stranded on Earth with nothing. It was a harsh reality, but it was one that seemed all too familiar to him in his own way. "You're not alone," Ethan said, his voice firm. "I'm here to help you, and I'm not going anywhere." The girls looked at each other, their eyes filled with uncertainty. They had been alone for so long, relying only on each other. But something in Ethan's words, something in the way he said them, made them believe him. For the first time, they allowed themselves to hope. Lyra nodded, her voice quiet but steady. "Thank you. We don't know how we can repay you, but we will find a way." Ethan smiled softly, his heart feeling lighter than it had in years. "No need to repay me," he said. "You've already done more than enough just by trusting me." As the fire crackled in the hearth, the three of them sat in silence, the weight of their shared history hanging heavy in the air. But in that moment, for the first time, they were not just survivors, they were something more. Together, the days passed slowly, and Ethan grew more accustomed to the presence of Lyra and Zara in his cabin. The initial awkwardness between them faded, replaced by a quiet understanding. While they never spoke much about their pasts, their conversations gradually turned into shared moments of reflection and curiosity. Lyra, despite her fierce exterior, began to open up more, often talking about her home planet, the world where power was everything. Zara, on the other hand, remained quieter, though her gaze softened when she looked at Ethan, and her shoulders seemed to relax when she realized he truly meant no harm. They had been through so much together, and now they were all stuck in this small cabin, on a strange planet, with no idea what their futures would hold. Ethan found himself becoming more protective of them, even though he knew little about their kind. The more he heard about their world, the more he realized how different Earth was from anything they had known. One evening, after a long day of silence and simple tasks, Ethan sat down by the fire, staring into the flames. Lyra was tending to the small garden outside, and Zara was reading one of the human books he had given her. Ethan couldn't help but wonder what the future held for all of them. He had no answers, only questions. He had helped them out of kindness, but in doing so, had he put himself in danger? His mind wandered, but before he could fall too deep into his thoughts, Lyra came inside. She looked different somehow, her posture more at ease. She walked over to the table, where Ethan sat, and paused for a moment before speaking. "Ethan," she began, her voice softer than usual, "I know we haven't exactly been the most welcoming guests." Ethan looked up, a small smile on his face. "You don't owe me anything, Lyra." She shook her head slightly, the faintest trace of a smile on her lips. "We were exiled for being weak. In our world, that's a death sentence. But you've shown us something we thought was impossible. We thought we were alone." Ethan felt a lump form in his throat at her words. "You're not alone," he said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "You never were." Lyra's eyes softened, and for a moment, the walls she had built around herself seemed to crumble. She sat down across from him, and there was a quiet moment of understanding between them. Just as the weight of the conversation seemed to settle, Zara entered the room, holding the book Ethan had given her. She glanced between them, her expression unreadable. "Is it okay if I join you?" she asked, her voice a little hesitant. Ethan nodded, gesturing to the empty chair next to him. Zara sat down slowly, her eyes still scanning the room, but there was a small shift in her demeanor. She was no longer on edge. "We've been talking about our pasts," Lyra said, looking at Zara. "About what led us here." Zara nodded, but her eyes didn't meet anyone else's. "I don't want to talk about it," she said quietly. "Not yet." Ethan respected her silence. He wasn't going to push them to share everything, not when it was clear they had been through so much. He knew that in time, they would speak when they were ready. He could wait. The room fell silent again, but this time, it wasn't awkward. There was something comforting about the stillness, the way they had settled into this strange new life. The fire crackled in the hearth, and the wind outside howled softly. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his mind racing with all the things he didn't know, but one thing was certain: he would protect them. No matter what came next, he would be there for them. He had already given them a place to stay, a safe haven, but there was more he could offer: his loyalty, his strength, his heart. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough to help them heal. As the night wore on, they sat together, not speaking much, but just being there. Lyra and Zara were still far from trusting humans, but something had changed between them. The bonds of survival, of shared hardship, had begun to weave a new kind of connection. Ethan wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was part of something bigger than himself, part of something that mattered. As the days passed, life in the cabin began to feel like a fragile piece. Ethan, Lyra, and Zara had settled into an uneasy rhythm, each day bringing with it new challenges and revelations. The forest outside the cabin remained as silent and foreboding as ever, the quiet broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of wildlife. But inside, there was a warmth, a connection slowly growing between the three of them. Ethan, who had been living alone for so long, found himself grateful for the presence of the two alien women. They were still distant, still guarded, but there were moments, small moments, where the walls between them seemed to drop. One afternoon, as Ethan worked on repairs to his cabin's roof, he heard footsteps behind him. He turned to find Lyra standing in the doorway, watching him. "You're not going to let me help?" she asked, her tone teasing but with a hint of genuine curiosity. Ethan smiled, wiping his hands on a rag. "I thought you'd prefer to rest. You've been through a lot." Lyra gave him a look that clearly said she didn't need rest. "I'm fine," she said, walking over to him. "I'm just not used to sitting idle." She picked up a hammer, her alien fingers wrapping around the handle with ease. "Let me give you a hand." Ethan stepped back, raising his hands in mock surrender. All right. Just don't break anything." Lyra smirked, her confidence in the task at hand almost amusing. As she climbed onto the roof to assist him, Ethan couldn't help but admire her determination. She wasn't just strong physically, There was a fire in her that wouldn't let her back down from anything. Zara had been quiet lately, often retreating into the cabin's small library or sitting by the fire, staring into the flames. Ethan had tried to engage her in conversation a few times, but she remained distant, her eyes always hiding something. He respected her silence, understanding that it wasn't easy for her to open up, not after everything they had been through. As he finished the repairs with Lyra's help, they both climbed down from the roof and dusted themselves off. Lyra seemed pleased with herself, and Ethan couldn't help but chuckle at her pride. Not bad for an alien, he teased, wiping his brow. Lyra laughed, a sound that was light and surprising coming from someone who had been so serious at first. Not bad for a human either, she shot back, her tone playful. The sound of Zara's footsteps interrupted their moment of banter. She entered the yard, her eyes catching Lyra's. "We need to talk," Zara said, her voice serious. Ethan felt a slight chill run down his spine. "About what?" he asked, his tone more cautious now. "It's about the future," Zara replied, her gaze unwavering. "We can't stay here forever. We need to leave. We need to find out what's out there." Ethan blinked, surprised by the sudden shift in her tone. "You mean, like, leave this place? Go somewhere else?" he asked, his mind racing. "Yes," Zara said. "We've been hiding here long enough. The authorities, our people, will be searching for us. They won't stop. And Earth isn't safe for us. Not in the long run." Ethan hesitated. He knew she was right. As much as he had wanted to protect them, keep them safe, he couldn't deny the reality of their situation. Lyra stepped forward, her expression serious now. "We need to figure out how to fight back. How to survive," she said, her voice low but determined. "And we can't do that from here. We need to move." Ethan looked at both of them, his heart heavy with the weight of their words. He had never been a fighter, never been one for conflict. But this was different. They weren't just asking for his help, they were challenging him to be more, to rise to a new kind of responsibility. A responsibility that would change everything. "So what's the plan?" Ethan asked, his voice steady but filled with uncertainty. Zara's eyes softened, but her determination remained. "We have to leave the cabin, Ethan. We need to find a way to contact the outside world, to gather information. There are others like us out there, people who might help us." Lyra nodded in agreement. "And we need to learn more about Earth. We need to understand how this planet works, how we can survive in this new environment. Together." Ethan felt a surge of resolve rising within him. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about fighting for something bigger, about giving Lyra and Zara a chance at a future that they had lost on their own world. He looked at both of them, and for the first time, he saw them not just as two lost souls in need of help, but as allies, as people who could change everything. "All right," Ethan said, his voice firm. "Let's do it. Let's get ready to move." The fire crackled softly in the background, the flames dancing as if in approval. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Ethan felt a sense of purpose. He was no longer alone in this fight, and neither were they. Together, they would face whatever came next. The days leading up to their departure were filled with preparation and uncertainty. Ethan, Lyra, and Zara worked together, each contributing in their own way. The cabin that had been their temporary sanctuary now felt more like a cage, a reminder that they could no longer hide from the world outside. Ethan knew the time had come to leave, to face the unknown. His heart ached at the thought of leaving the only place that had felt like home in years, but he couldn't ignore the reality of their situation. They needed to move, and they needed to move quickly. As the sun began to set on their final night at the cabin, the three of them gathered their supplies, what little they had, and made plans for the journey ahead. Lyra was the first to speak, her voice steady but filled with determination. "We need to leave at dawn," she said, her violet eyes reflecting the flickering light of the fire. "The longer we stay here, the more dangerous it becomes. Our people will be searching for us, and if we're not careful, we'll be caught." Ethan nodded, understanding the urgency. He had always been a man of routine, but this was different. This was survival. "Where will we go?" he asked, his voice low. Zara, who had been silent for most of the evening, spoke up. "We need to find a city, a place where we can blend in," she said. "We'll gather information, make contacts, and try to learn more about Earth. It's not going to be easy, but it's the only option we have." Lyra agreed. "We can't stay here any longer. It's too risky. But if we move quickly, we can make it to a larger settlement. From there, we can figure out our next steps. The weight of their words hung heavily in the air. Ethan could see the resolve in their eyes, the fire that had been lit within them. They were no longer just survivors. They were fighters. They were going to make a stand. The next morning, as the first light of dawn broke through the trees, they gathered their belongings and left the cabin behind. Ethan carried his rifle, just in case, while Lyra and Zara each had a small bag with their essentials. They didn't have much, but they had each other, and that was enough. The journey was slow at first, the dense forest making it difficult to move quickly. Ethan led the way, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings for any sign of danger. Lyra and Zara followed closely behind, their footsteps light but purposeful. They had to stay alert, they had to stay together. Hours passed, and the sun climbed higher in the sky. The landscape began to change as they neared the outskirts of the forest. The trees thinned, and the air grew warmer. They were getting closer to civilization. Ethan could feel the tension in the air, the anticipation of what was to come. They had no idea what awaited them, but they were ready. As the day wore on, they finally reached the edge of the forest, and before them lay a small town. It was nothing special, just a few buildings scattered along a dirt road, with a few people walking about their business. But to Lyra, Zara, and Ethan, it felt like the first step toward freedom. They had made it. For the first time in what felt like forever, Ethan allowed himself to breathe a little easier. They had survived. They had escaped the isolation of the cabin and found their way to the next chapter of their journey. Lyra and Zara seemed to relax as well, though there was still a wariness in their eyes. They weren't out of danger yet. They knew that. But for now, they were safe. For now, they had made it. As they walked down the dirt road toward the town, Ethan couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. He had done the right thing. He had helped them. And in doing so, he had found something he thought he had lost long ago: purpose. The road ahead was uncertain, but they would face it together. And that, Ethan realized, was all that mattered. The town was smaller than Ethan had expected, a collection of old wooden buildings clustered together along a dusty road, with only a handful of people moving about their daily routines. The air was thick with the scent of hay and the distant hum of a market in the center of town. For a moment, everything felt strangely normal. But Ethan knew better than to let his guard down too quickly. Lyra and Zara walked beside him, their eyes scanning the surroundings, constantly alert. Even though they were in what seemed like a peaceful place, Ethan knew that danger could come from anywhere, and the last thing he wanted was for them to be caught off guard. As they entered the town, the few townspeople they encountered gave them curious looks, but no one stopped them. Ethan's eyes flitted over the small group of people, mostly farmers and traders, going about their business, unaware of the strangers in their midst. His hand instinctively rested on the grip of his rifle, just in case. Lyra and Zara, for all their alien features, blended in better than he expected. The long sleeves of their tunics hid their alien skin, and their faces, though beautiful and otherworldly, were calm and composed, hiding any trace of the panic they must have been feeling. "We need information," Zara said, breaking the silence as they walked. Her voice was low, but there was no mistaking the urgency in her tone. Ethan nodded, his mind working through the possibilities. They needed to find out where they were, what kind of people lived here, and whether there were any signs of danger. "Let's start by checking the market," Ethan said, his voice steady. "It's the best place to gather information." They made their way toward the heart of the town, where the market was held. The sounds of haggling and the clinking of coins filled the air as the townspeople traded goods. Fruits, vegetables, livestock, and other supplies were piled high on makeshift tables, with people shouting to make deals. It was a scene of organized chaos, and Ethan could sense the undercurrent of tension just beneath the surface. He didn't like it. As they wandered through the market, Ethan kept his eyes sharp, watching the people around them. A few of them glanced at the alien women curiously, but no one seemed to take too much notice. They moved past stalls of produce and hand-woven goods, their footsteps echoing against the wooden planks of the market floor. It wasn't long before they approached a booth where an older man, weathered by years in the sun, was selling tools. He looked up at them as they approached, his expression hardening for a split second before he quickly masked it with a forced smile. "You're not from around here, are you?" he asked, his voice gravelly. Ethan stopped, his gaze narrowing slightly. "Just passing through," he replied, his tone casual. "We're looking for some supplies." The man studied them for a moment longer, his eyes lingering on Lyra and Zara. "I see," he muttered, scratching his chin. "Well, we've got what you need, but be careful. People don't take kindly to strangers in these parts. Not unless you've got business with the right people." Ethan tensed at his words. There was an edge to the old man's voice, a warning buried beneath his casual tone. He made a mental note to stay on alert. "We're not looking for trouble," Ethan said evenly. "Just passing through." The man seemed to accept that, nodding slowly. "Fair enough," he said, turning back to his wares. "But if you're really looking to know what's going on around here, you might want to talk to the sheriff. He's the one who keeps things under control." Ethan's interest piqued. "A sheriff? That could be useful." He nodded to the man, slipping a few coins onto the table in exchange for a small bag of supplies. "Thanks," Ethan said, turning away. "We'll keep that in mind." As they walked away from the booth, Zara looked up at Ethan, her expression unreadable. "The sheriff?" she asked. Ethan nodded, his mind already turning over the implications. "The sheriff's the key to understanding what's really going on here," he said, his voice low. "If we can talk to him, we can get a better idea of how dangerous this place really is." Lyra's gaze flicked over to the sheriff's office, a building at the far end of the town. It was an imposing structure, its dark windows giving it a grim, almost foreboding presence. "Let's go," she said, her voice steady but filled with the quiet determination that had become familiar to Ethan. "The sooner we get this done, the sooner we can move on." Ethan glanced at her, then at Zara, who seemed just as resolute. They didn't know what they were walking into, but they couldn't afford to hesitate. With a deep breath, Ethan led the way toward the sheriff's office, the weight of their journey pressing down on him. He didn't know if they would find allies or enemies inside that building, but he knew one thing for sure. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. The sheriff's office stood at the edge of the town square, its dark windows reflecting the low light of the setting sun. The building was imposing, a structure of brick and wood, with a small porch that creaked under the weight of time. Ethan stood before it for a moment, his hand resting lightly on the rifle slung across his back. Lyra and Zara stood behind him, their eyes scanning the surroundings, alert for any sign of danger. The old man in the market had warned them about the sheriff, and Ethan had a feeling that their next move would set the tone for everything that came after. "This is it," Ethan said quietly, turning to face the two women. "Stay close. If anything feels off, we get out fast." Lyra nodded, her expression unreadable, while Zara merely gave a slight tilt of her head, her gaze still distant. Ethan felt the weight of their trust on his shoulders. They didn't know this world, and he was their guide, their protector now. He could only hope he was up to the task. With a deep breath, Ethan stepped onto the porch and knocked on the door. The sound echoed in the quiet of the street, and for a moment, there was only silence. Then, a gruff voice came from inside. Yeah, hold your horses." The door swung open, revealing a tall man with a stern face, wearing a worn sheriff's badge on his chest. His eyes, hard and calculating, swept over Ethan and then flicked to Lyra and Zara. "What do you want?" he asked, his tone flat but filled with suspicion. Ethan stood tall, trying to exude calm confidence. "We're just passing through," he said, his voice steady. "We were told you might be able to help us find our way." The sheriff's eyes narrowed slightly, clearly not convinced. "Passing through, huh?" he muttered, taking a step back to allow them to enter. "Well, you've come to the right place if you need answers. But don't expect me to hold your hand. I don't do favors for strangers." Ethan stepped inside, his eyes scanning the small, dimly lit room. A desk sat in the center, papers scattered across it, and a few wooden chairs were pushed against the walls. The air smelled of dust and tobacco. The sheriff motioned for them to sit. "So, what's your story?" he asked, his voice gruff as he leaned against the desk, arms crossed. Ethan exchanged a quick glance with Lyra and Zara before sitting down. "We're just travelers," Ethan said, keeping his voice casual. "We've heard some rumors about trouble in the area. We were hoping you could shed some light on what's going on." The sheriff's gaze hardened as he looked at them. "Rumors, huh?" He chuckled darkly. "Rumors are dangerous things around here. But I'll tell you this, if you're looking to get involved in the wrong things, you're better off leaving now. Things are more complicated than you realize. Ethan sat up straighter, his attention sharpening. What do you mean? He asked. The sheriff's eyes flicked to Lyra and Zara, his gaze lingering on them for a moment before he spoke. There's more to this town than you think. People like you, people who don't belong, have a way of stirring up trouble. And not everyone here is as welcoming as I am. Ethan felt a chill creep down his spine. He had known that this town wasn't as simple as it seemed, but he hadn't expected it to be so tense, so filled with unspoken danger. We're just looking to stay out of the way, Ethan said, trying to keep his voice calm. We don't want trouble. We just need some information. We'll leave as soon as we've got what we need. The sheriff leaned back, his expression thoughtful for a moment. Then he sighed and looked at them with a mix of caution and resignation. Fine, he said. I'll tell you what you need to know. But I'm warning you, stick your noses where they don't belong, and I won't be able to protect you. He paused, as if weighing his words carefully. There are factions in this town, ones you don't want to mess with. Some of them are powerful, and they don't take kindly to outsiders asking questions. Lyra's voice broke the silence, calm but filled with an edge. What factions? She asked, her eyes locked on the sheriff. The sheriff studied her for a moment, clearly sizing her up. He seemed to think for a moment before speaking again. There's a lot of politics in this town, a lot of power plays. The mayor runs things, but he's got his hands full with a few other interests. There's a group of traders who have a lot of influence, and they don't like outsiders meddling in their business. He glanced at the door, as if expecting someone to walk in at any moment. The less you know, the better, he muttered, more to himself than to them. Ethan could sense that they had pushed as far as they could with the sheriff. He stood up, his hand resting on the grip of his rifle again. Thanks for the information, he said, keeping his voice even. We'll be on our way. The sheriff didn't respond immediately. He watched them as they left, his eyes lingering on Lyra and Zara, before muttering under his breath. Just remember what I said. Keep your distance. As they stepped out into the fading light of the evening, Ethan felt a sense of unease settle over him. The sheriff had given them some answers, but they had only scratched the surface. There was something deeper, something hidden beneath the surface of this town. But one thing was clear. They were in danger, and they couldn't afford to stay in one place for too long. Ethan turned to Lyra and Zara, his expression serious. We need to be careful from here on out, he said, his voice low. There's more going on here than we realized. We need to stay under the radar. They nodded in agreement, and together, they walked away from the sheriff's office, the weight of their next move heavy on their minds. The sun had begun to dip below the horizon as Ethan, Lyra, and Zara made their way through the quiet streets of the town, the day's events weighing heavily on their minds. The sheriff had given them a warning, but his words had only scratched the surface of the danger they felt lurking beneath the town's seemingly peaceful exterior. As they walked, Ethan's eyes darted from side to side, ever watchful, aware that they were no longer just strangers passing through. They were now part of something bigger, something more dangerous. The sheriff's office was behind them, and with it, the promise of more questions than answers. The three of them continued down the road, their footsteps echoing in the stillness of the evening. Despite the threat hanging in the air, Ethan felt a sense of urgency, a need to press forward, to find the answers they sought. Lyra and Zara were silent, their minds clearly occupied with the weight of the conversation they had just left behind. We need to move fast, Ethan said, his voice low and focused. The longer we stay here, the more likely we are to attract attention. The sheriff's right about one thing. There's something dangerous going on here, and we can't afford to get caught up in it. Lyra nodded, her violet eyes scanning the buildings around them. Agreed. We need to find more information, but we also need to be cautious. The people in this town may not be as welcoming as they seem. Zara remained quiet, her gaze fixed on the ground, as if she were deep in thought. Ethan glanced at her, concerned by her silence. Zara, he said softly, what's on your mind? Zara hesitated for a moment before speaking, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm not sure we can trust anyone here. The sheriff warned us about factions in the town, but there's more to it than that. I've been here before. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. What do you mean? He asked, his voice filled with concern. Zara looked up at him, her expression tense. I was part of the rebellion that was exiled. Some of the people here, some of the factions, they have connections to my past. They know who I am, and they know what I've done. Ethan's mind raced as he processed her words. So you think someone here might recognize you? Lyra asked, her voice steady but filled with uncertainty. It's possible, Zara replied, her eyes narrowing. If they do, we're in even more danger than we thought. I don't know if we can stay here without drawing attention. Ethan clenched his jaw, his thoughts spinning. He had known their journey would be fraught with challenges, but this was different. They weren't just hiding from the authorities anymore. They were being hunted by their past, by enemies who knew exactly who they were. We need to get out of here, Ethan said, his voice resolute. We can't stay in one place for too long, and if Zara's right, we're already at risk just by being here. Lyra and Zara both nodded, and together, they quickened their pace, moving deeper into the heart of the town. They needed to find shelter, a place to regroup and plan their next move. They passed by more buildings, the quiet streets now feeling suffocating, as if the walls themselves were closing in on them. As they reached the edge of the town, they spotted a small inn tucked away in a corner. The sign above the door was worn, but it looked like a safe place to rest for the night. We should head in there, Ethan suggested, his eyes scanning the area. It's quiet, and we'll have a chance to figure out our next move. Without waiting for a response, he pushed open the door and entered the dimly lit inn. The inside was small but cozy, with a crackling fire in the hearth and a few patrons seated at wooden tables, their conversations hushed. The innkeeper, an elderly woman with gray hair and sharp eyes, looked up as they entered. Room for 3, she asked, her voice raspy but friendly. Ethan nodded, stepping forward. Yes, please. We just need a place to rest for the night. The innkeeper studied them for a moment, then nodded and motioned for them to follow her. I'll show you to your room, she said, leading them up a narrow staircase to a small room at the end of the hall. The room was modest, with a single bed and a few chairs by the window, but it was clean and comfortable. As the door closed behind them, Ethan exhaled, allowing himself a brief moment of relief. They had made it this far, but the journey was far from over. We can stay here for the night, Ethan said, his voice low. But tomorrow, we need to move again. We can't afford to stay in one place for too long. Lyra and Zara both nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. They had been on the run for so long, and while they had found temporary safety, they knew that their past would catch up with them sooner or later. We'll figure it out, Lyra said quietly. We've made it this far. Ethan looked at them both, his heart swelling with a sense of pride. They had come a long way together, and no matter what came next, they would face it as a team. Together, they would survive. The next morning came far too quickly, the first light of dawn filtering through the cracks in the curtains of their small room. Ethan woke first, his senses immediately alert as he listened to the stillness around him. Lyra and Zara were still asleep, their quiet breathing filling the room. It had been a long and exhausting journey, but they had made it this far. The weight of their mission, their shared past, and the uncertainty of what lay ahead hung over him like a heavy cloud. Ethan stood up slowly, careful not to disturb the others, and walked over to the window. The small town was still, the streets empty at this hour, but the quiet was almost deafening. He wondered how long they could stay hidden here, how long they could keep running from their past. After a moment, Lyra stirred, her violet eyes opening as she sat up in bed, her movements graceful despite the tension that seemed to surround her. What time is it? She asked, her voice still thick with sleep. Early, Ethan replied, glancing back at her. We need to move soon. Lyra nodded, her gaze shifting toward the door. Do you think they know we're here? She asked quietly. Ethan shook his head. I don't know, but we can't afford to wait around to find out. We need to keep moving. Zara woke next, her eyes blinking as she sat up, taking in the room with a look of quiet calculation. Where are we going? She asked, her voice steady despite the heaviness in the air. We'll head for the nearest city, Ethan said. The sheriff told us there are factions here, but if we get to a larger settlement, we might have a better chance of blending in, getting information. Zara nodded but didn't say anything. She had been quiet since their conversation with the sheriff, and Ethan could tell that her mind was still racing. We'll stick together, Ethan continued, his voice low but firm. We keep a low profile, we stay alert, and we don't trust anyone until we know more. Got it. Lyra and Zara both nodded, their expressions serious. It was clear that they were ready to move, ready to face whatever came next. They had been through too much already to hesitate now. They gathered their few belongings, packing quickly but efficiently, and then stepped out into the cool morning air. The streets of the town were still quiet, and for a moment, it seemed like nothing had changed. But Ethan knew better. They were no longer just travelers passing through. They were fugitives, running from a past that was catching up with them. As they walked toward the edge of town, Ethan kept his eyes scanning their surroundings, always alert for any sign of trouble. They couldn't afford to be caught off guard. They didn't know who might be watching or who might be waiting for them. "Let's stick to the main road," Ethan suggested. "It'll be safer, and it'll get us out of town faster." Lyra and Zara nodded, and together, they walked toward the main road that led out of town. The landscape around them was vast, the open fields stretching out as far as the eye could see. There was a sense of freedom in the air, but it was tempered by the reality of their situation. They weren't free yet, not by a long shot. As they walked, Ethan's thoughts turned to the future. What would happen once they reached the next city? What kind of help could they find there? And, more importantly, who would they have to trust? The world was still a dangerous place, and it seemed like every step they took only led them closer to the unknown. But for the first time since their arrival on Earth, Ethan felt a flicker of hope. They had survived this long, and as long as they stayed together, there was nothing they couldn't face. He glanced at Lyra and Zara, their expressions focused, their steps in sync with his. They were a team now, and that was something he had never expected to find again. They had all lost something. He, his family, they, their homes and everything they had known. But together, they had found something else, a new purpose, a new reason to fight. As they continued down the road, the sun rising higher in the sky, Ethan couldn't help but feel a small sense of pride. They had made it this far, and they would keep going. No matter what came next, they would face it together. The road ahead was uncertain, but Ethan knew that as long as they stayed united, there was nothing they couldn't overcome. They had survived the past. Now, it was time to shape their future. And in that moment, for the first time in a long time, Ethan believed that they might just make it.